Welcome to the New York Times Popcast, your get out of my room of music news and criticism. I'm your host, Joe Coscarelli, filling in for John Caramonica. That was Internet Baby Interlude by PinkPantheress from her new album, Heaven Knows, out today even, depending on when you're listening to this. We are here with Lindsay Zoladz, critic at the New York Times.
Hello. /Internet Baby.
/Internet Baby, a lifelong Internet Baby. Lindsay recently spent time with PinkPantheress, and we will hear all about that. We are also joined by Kemi Alemoru, a freelance culture writer for GQ, ID, Vogue, The Guardian, and others. Kemi also spent time with PinkPantheress of late. Kemi, thanks for joining us on Podcast.
Hello.
So let's just jump right in. PinkPantheress, maybe one of the biggest breakout stars of the last 2 years of post-pandemic pop music. She is here with arguably her debut album. We could talk about that, whether the previous project counts. I think we're really in a moment of managing expectations when it comes to how projects are labeled, marketed, and delivered. Let's just jump right in there. Is this PinkPantheress's debut album, Kemi?
This album, I think, is completely different from all of her other work, just because when you first came into contact with PinkPantheress, she was finding her feet and doing things on her own. So this is the first time that there's the sort of machine behind her of her being signed and working with other artists in order to get this album across the line. Before, it was a much more like insular process for her of trial and error and sampling things that she didn't even have permission to sample. Whereas now, if she wants to get a song across the board, she's got to speak to several people about it. She's got to know how to actually articulate her ideas in a way that she seemed to be saying was like a completely new process for her, because like having to explain the essence of a song verbally is so different to you just playing around in your bedroom. So yeah, in a way, it's the first album of the new iteration of PinkPantheress, which is hyper visible and like we can see her face, we know who she is. She set a release date. It's very different from her just dropping songs on TikTok.
Right. I think that's well put. And you sort of alluded to the mysterious, enigmatic rise of PinkPantheress. Like, Lindsay, can you take us back a little bit to that pandemic-y moment when PinkPantheress starts popping up first on SoundCloud and TikTok, and then also in the mouths and on the social media accounts of various tastemakers, let's say?
It feels like a while ago now, but it was only 2021 that she really started releasing music in the form that we have come to know it. And when I spoke to her, she talked about she tried uploading on various different sites. Like she had a SoundCloud moment and her stuff didn't really hit there. She tried other means like just YouTube and stuff like that. And then TikTok is really where she blows up. And there's something about her sound which translates well to the aesthetic of TikTok, the sort of insular bedroom pop, dreamy quality to it. There's a chirpiness to some of the beats, and there are sped up remixes of PinkPantheress and everything like that. Like her music fit into that world, I think, without her necessarily trying too hard to fit what makes sense in that world. So it was this moment where, as the platform itself was becoming huge, and she rode on that. But as we've been discussing, like I think something that's fascinating about her is that we are able to see and hear this process of her learning how to become a producer and learning what sorts of music she wants to make, getting better and refining her vision, but also trying to figure out a way, I think, to keep a little bit of that scrappy DIY energy that was there in the beginning, when she just was literally finding songs and instrumentals on YouTube and singing over them with, as we said, without getting permission. So I think that's the moment she comes up in. But there's the fascination of just like watching her develop in real time. I think she's only like 19 or 20 when those songs start popping off. She's 22 now. There's that element to it as well.
Let's listen to a second of Just a Waste, which is, I believe, the first PinkPantheress snippet that went really viral on TikTok or began to go viral. I think she posted this in December 2020, maybe. And then as 2021 picks up, it starts to find traction along with some of her other snippets and then eventually some full-length songs, which were basically snippet length themselves. But this one, as Lindsay mentioned, is basically her singing over an existing song, one that she did not have the rights to, in this case, Michael Jackson's Off the Wall. So let's just listen to a little bit of that to get a taste of the earliest PinkPantheress music.
How did it ever get so wrong? Crying in the stall of a washroom floor. You niggas don't know where I'm from. Don't know how I got it, but I'm all alone.
So that's one way people came into contact with her. Kemi, do you remember the first time you heard PinkPantheress? Like, how did you first encounter her or her music?
I do remember the first time. It was actually Just a Waste, and that song slaps. I really love Just a Waste, mostly because I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan, and I can't really play Michael Jackson in front of my friends anymore for obvious reasons. Right. They all really want me to let him go.
Although I would say most people in public, at least in New York, don't care.
Yeah, most people in public, they say that they're not listening, but I think we all slightly are listening to him just behind closed doors. But I was in my house, it was locked down. I live with 4 other people, so it was a bit chaotic in there. We'd all gone a little bit crazy, and we were in the garden just trying to like feel like we were outside, and then someone was playing Just a Waste on the speakers, and I remember thinking, oh my god, it's Michael. But then it had this like sickly sweet vocal over it, and I was just thinking, like, what is this? This is such a good song, and like everyone's dancing to it and no one's noticed that it's Michael Jackson, so I can just enjoy it without anybody like lecturing me about the ethics of listening and streaming his songs. So yeah, like that was the first time I encountered her, and obviously it being locked down, her early work really is the soundtrack to a lot of young people's worst moments. We were all stuck in the house and just looking for songs to play that sort of made you bop, but weren't too happy because we're all quite miserable. And that's the thing about PinkPantheress, is that her songs are quite miserable, but they do have a beat that means that you can at least dance in your misery. So that's where I go to in my mind when I listen to the first PinkPantheress songs is, yeah, just national lockdowns, really.
And there really is that interplay between the samples and the recognizable, much-loved samples in some of her earliest work, and then the way she's depressedly humming over them or like murmuring over them. Like, Lindsay, did you have an experience where you first heard PinkPantheress and either recognized the source material or that this was a new artist in our midst?
I think I came to her by the time she was moving away from the really obvious sampling, which is pretty early on still. And, you know, the Michael Jackson sample, I asked her about that in the interview and she was like, legally, I'm not allowed to talk about that.
Right. It like basically doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
It's dead.
But I think something that's interesting is that it seemed as though that was maybe the only estate that had asked her to take something down or I think that song has been like officially removed from the internet. You can still find it in a lot of places, but I think that was the only like litigious sample. And something that I found fascinating talking to her is she was using source material from a lot of drum and bass music, a lot of like early aughts, just semi-obscure pop music and even some K-pop in there. And it seems like all of the artists who she's sampling eventually gave her permission. I don't know, like financially and legally, like what the label was doing and when they came in at that time. But she told me she was kind of operating under this idea that if people ask you to take it down, that's a good thing because that means enough people are listening to it that they know that I'm doing this. So there is this kind of like guerrilla internet aspect to it.
So that's like wonderfully naive, right?
Totally.
But it's so impressive to your friends if you're like, oh, what did you do today? Oh, the Michael Jackson estate got in touch with me and told me to take the song down. You are winning. That is good amount of fame. That's a great touch.
And so there's the Michael Jackson sample, which is one thing. And there's a couple others. I Must Apologize, early one, Doing Crystal Waters. But I want to drill down on the idea of the choice of the music she was sampling and specifically its relationship to UK music scenes and pop adjacent scenes. Break It Off has Adam F. Circles, big drum and bass song from the 90s. There's Sweet Female Attitude, Flowers, karaoke version, I guess, in Pain. And even Craig David, 7 Days, Passion is maybe at least alluding to that. Kemi, can you talk a little bit about what you heard in the way she was mining specifically UK pop music?
Yeah, I think her music is very much situated in a type of nostalgia that is just second nature to like anyone who grew up in Britain in... You said the aughts, which is so cute that Americans say that for noughties. In the noughties, there's all these genres that she kind of even really connected with that much because she's really young. It's like sounds from clubs at a time and she was too young to be going to the club. But I think it's just the way that British people listen to music is that we do go back to our homegrown genres quite a lot and it does play on the radio. And if you had the music channels, like if you ever had like Sky TV, which is, what's the American equivalent of that? Like maybe TiVo. I think it's sounds that you grew up with and that you listened to quite a lot. So it was sort of a shorthand to anyone growing up at a certain time. I felt a lot of the samples that she was using, like in Attracted to You, which is a song that samples, what is that band called? I think it's called like Just Jack, which is like a random one-hit wonder type band from the sort of era.
This is way too British for us to know.
But that's the thing. It's so hyper specific. You know, the time when Lily Allen was singing like in a stupidly British accent and you had like Kate Nash singing in a stupidly British accent, like just comically overly British accents. She's sampling from that era of like hyper Britishness of the mid-noughties with indie sounds in Attracted to You. And yeah, Sweet Female Attitude, that's just a song that anyone who's had a birthday party in the UK, like you're gonna listen to those. Like they're like, they're just a part of the bread and butter of British parties, really.
Let's listen to a little bit of Pain by PinkPantheress. So, Lindsay, I'm interested because I think what Kemi is getting at in part is that this is like real nostalgia for British people. And yet for an American audience, like some of these songs are still quite obscure, even if they are popular and recognizable. So I feel like there was like a divide in the way she was received at first, because to us, it's like she's crate digging, whereas to Kemi, it's like she's referencing birthday parties for 13-year-olds. Do you see some of that?
I think what's interesting is that she doesn't perceive that, though. I think there is something quintessentially British, at least like to my American perspective about her. And Kemi, I think you articulated that really well and that was like useful for Joe and I probably. But I think that there hasn't been like a big British pop crossover in quite some time. Like, I guess like Ed Sheeran, one that comes to mind, but like...
Are we just going to ignore Harry, which I'm fine with if you want to do that?
He's different. I don't know. As he's in a band.
You forgot that Harry was British for a second.
I did. No.
Freezing.
But I think even on that level, there just hasn't been a ton of crossover in the pop mainstream, which is kind of interesting because the digitization of music is globalization too. So it was interesting. I asked her about that. And she was like, I don't really think about that because my music was being heard by Americans and British people and everyone else on the internet at the same time. Like she didn't, I think other British crossover acts have had local success and then they've tried to like make it across the pond. It's like that whole kind of idea is just not in her vision at all. Like she was just like, I'm uploading songs. People are listening to them on the internet. I don't know who and where they're listening to. So I agree, Joe. Like, I think that the difference was in the reception and in the different audiences that like they were resonating with. But I think she wasn't thinking about that too strategically or anything. She was just like, this sounds good to me. This is like, these are sounds that I like. I think some of them too, like, are kind of obscure to her for the reason you pointed out, Kemi, that she's very young. Like, she's 22 years old now, starts uploading this music like in her late teens. And there's maybe a nostalgia, but I think she's like discovering some of these sounds and this music for the first time too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Some of these genres that she's calling on, like drum and bass and garage, you'd maybe hear those when you first start going to the club or you first start going to festivals. But she has that whole coming out journey hindered because she's actually inside. So she's at university when she first starts putting this music out, but she can't go out. Like, they don't really go out. She was just saying that they used to just drink in halls. So she's having her like coming out moment, her like emerging from being in her like familial home to just go and sit in bedrooms. And then she's just calling on these party songs from the past, but she can't actually, she's not leaving the house. So I found that really funny when I asked her, like, oh, where'd you go out? And she was saying that basically she doesn't. She's never really gone out. She's never really had that time when she's gone out because she went from lockdown to now like instant fame. So she can't go anywhere because she finds it too annoying.
Which is crazy because you really can hear that in the music, right? This is dance music. This is communal pop music made into bedroom pop by somebody who is literally stuck in their bedroom first by virtue of age and then by virtue of the pandemic lockdown and now by virtue of fame. Talk a little bit about, Kemi, about what we knew or know about PinkPantheress biographically. You've gotten at some of that, but I also think there was this bit of mystique that came with her as she first emerged, especially because some of these sounds were so familiar and yet the artist was shrouded. And she's kept some of that even to this day.
She's super private. You're not actually even allowed to write her name in the profile. That was stressed to me several times before I wrote the profile. So in terms of like details about PinkPantheress's life, they're quite hard to come across. And when I was interviewing her, I was really aware of that thing of wanting to pry and know a bit more about this really mysterious artist, but like knowing that I'd probably come against a bit of pushback if I dug a bit too hard. But I really loved when I spoke to her, just like how normal she was. Like, I really hate doing profiles of people who are super famous because they're just so boring and they don't say anything, or they like try and say something and sound really deep. And they don't sound deep. They don't sound deep at all. But she was just normal. Like, she was talking to me like a normal person. And she was talking about her journey of just feeling really awkward and wanting to do music, but not really knowing whether her friends were just lying when they said that she was good at music. So that's why she started posting online and she was doing it anonymously. And then obviously she leaves school. She's not from London. She's from like the outskirts. It's basically countryside. So then she moves into London for uni and she's doing, I think she's studying film at uni, which is why she knows how to direct.
Right.
I should check my notes, but yeah, I think she was studying film. And then she dropped out because, yeah, she wasn't really enjoying it. And actually the traction she was getting online really quickly was showing her that she was really good at music and she probably didn't need to finish her full degree because it's £9,000 a year to do your degree in England, and who wants to waste that money on...
Sounds like a bargain to us.
Yeah, that's so true. That does sound like a bargain to you, but it's crazy to us. So I think she was just like, I'm just going to leave and then see how this goes and see if I can make a career out of it. And at every single step, even her image... She was saying that she was feeling really insecure at first about the idea that people would be commenting on how she looked, and that she's only really just started to like how she looks. And when you see the album roll out now, she's all over it. You can see her face. You can tell she's been styled. But I think it took her a really long time to be able to step out in front of the world and do all of that. But even though she recorded this recent album in LA, and she lives in LA basically at the moment, she lives in between LA and London, I think to her, it's really important for her to retain that sense of Britishness, which she does through the sound of the contemporary sound of sadness was the amazing set of words she used, that it's really hard to replicate the contemporary sound of British sadness. And it's so true, because we are just a nation of just really sad people. And I think she really captures that so well in her music.
Each generation expresses that in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that's what's great about British music is that, yeah, we're a nation of sad sacks, but at the end of the day, if you put a microphone in front of someone or you give them a pen, we will come out with something brilliant. And I think she's shown that she's taken all of those inspirations and she's soaked them up like a sponge, but she's also got this uncanny way of communicating it for the internet generation who don't even need to have those references. Like American teens don't have that references. She is their first introduction to a lot of these sounds, but it still sounds so of the moment.
Totally. So in late 2021, you get To Hell With It. That's PinkPantheress' debut mixtape, framed as a mixtape. It's not even 19 minutes long, 10 songs. They're all about a minute and change. Lindsay, did you get the sense from her that as she's coming out of that, she wants to do something radically different? Was this the sort of bookend to her internet time, or do you see the new album, Heaven Knows, as like a continuation of what she was doing on To Hell With It?
I think it's definitely more of a cohesive statement for her. Like she definitely considers it the debut album. And I think the difference to her is that the songs on To Hell With It were made at different times and they weren't focusing on a certain theme. She was just in the studio, like making songs. And
the singles collection in some way.
Yeah. And she's talked too about how she's a really quick worker in the studio. Like that was stressed to me of like other people that I talked to for the piece too, that she's not toiling all night in the studio on a beat or on getting a certain melody right. She's spending 2 and 3 hours on a song. And if it's not really coming together, she scraps it and moves on to the next thing. So I think that working approach, I think you can tell in some sense in just the kind of snippet quality of some of the songs, at least up until now, that she's become associated with. There's just get to the good part, only the good part, and then get out. They're all, I don't know that there's
TikTok core.
Yeah, totally. So there's a certain immediacy and kind of a spark to the best songs. I think her music flows together really nicely. Like you could have made your own playlist of PinkPantheress songs and like it maybe would have sounded like an album. But to her, those were really disparate things that didn't have this cohesive whole. I think something that surprised me about Heaven Knows was how there is a theme and almost like a narrative running through it. It's really focused on this idea of love in the afterlife. And this, as we've been saying, this kind of contrast with her between the really upbeat, sugary, super sweet melodies and then this undercurrent of darkness and even a fixation on death and obsession and things like that are always there and that I think give the music this really interesting edge. So I think that particular theme is teased out a little more directly on this album. Even in calling it Heaven Knows, she's nodding to Hell With It, a follow-up and a reference to its opposite. That's the difference, at least in the thematics to me. But I'm curious how you guys think about the difference in the sound, because there's certainly, she's come a long way since that first mixtape and the first song she's doing on top of samples. So
right. And I think another important thing to note and the real maybe transition pivot moment is what happens in between the release, and that's Boy's a Liar.
We have not mentioned Boy's a Liar yet.
We have not mentioned Boy's a Liar. So let's listen to a little bit of Boy's a Liar and then we can get into it.
Shit that I should've known. So I
We're about a year out now from the release of Boys a Liar in November 22. And this song is a huge hit both in the UK and in the US, though the US version gets a little jolt from a little rapper called Ice Spice. But Kemi, can you talk a little bit about Boys a Liar as crossover sensation across the pond?
It was a major moment for both rappers. I'd interviewed them both this year, and I feel, to be honest, they're both at a very similar stage of being on the precipice of blowing up. So it was an amazing partnership. And I did really like the contrast of Ice Spice, who's usually very big and brash, and PinkPantheress, who actually just really sounds very meek most of the time. I thought it was a great combination. I think when thinking about like how that's maybe influenced this next album, weirdly, she sounds very chilled when she's talking about Boys a Liar. Like when I was interviewing her, it was like just something that had happened, it had happened, and yeah, she moved on from it. Like she's so matter of fact about the fact that her and Ice Spice did that collab, when anybody else from the outside would be like, this was a huge life-changing moment. To her, I think it's just something that she did with an artist that she really appreciates and really vibes with, and then she just kept it moving. I think for everybody else who's just been introduced to her, though, it's now what's going to come next. That was a huge hit. It really shows that she has charting potential, and this could be the beginning of like superstardom for PinkPantheress. But I think in typical PinkPantheress fashion, she's just very laid back about it.
So it reaches number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the US. But Lindsay, I feel like you and I have, and our colleagues have had some version of this conversation. Is this a PinkPantheress record, or is this an Ice Spice record? Like, was that moment as much about PinkPantheress, or did it just happen to coincide with the Ice Spice explosion?
I think it's both, but I think the crucial thing is that she was the one that knew that it was going to align with the Ice Spice moment. Part 1 of Boys a Liar, which is just PinkPantheress, that comes out in November of last year. And then I think it's January or February of this year that we get part 2 with Ice Spice. And PinkPantheress got that feature on her own. I talked to the producer Muramasa, who has worked a lot with PinkPantheress, and he was telling me that he didn't even know she got Ice Spice on the remix of the song that he basically produced with her until they were shooting the music video. Which is pretty incredible. Yeah. That's not generally how it's done, especially in the major label world. And he loved it.
You don't think that's how Taylor got her on Karma? Is that a no comment?
I would actually love to know the answer to that, and I think we never will.
Right.
But I think that's
email
something.
Us.
Yeah, please. But I think that's something that there's a transparency to PinkPantheress and the way she knows what's going to hit a few months from now, or she very much has her ear to the internet and to the whatever the ground
in the demo.
Version of. She's in the demo. So I think it is a PinkPantheress song in the sense that she knew that it needed to be an Ice Spice song too, to pop off the way that it really did, especially over here, and become that just crossover hit that she had been waiting for. And I agree, Kemi, that she's very nonchalant about all of this. And she seems like someone that, like, even with this debut album, which has a lot going on and there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, I felt like she's like already onto the next thing. And it's just, she was talking to me about how she's really into nu metal right now and wants to like make songs that sample more nu metal songs. I know. And I was like, yes, let's go. But she's very much like, you use the word sponge, and she is like I think something that's cool about someone being like, I hate the term digital native. She has grown up with the internet just being there, and with every song in history, more or less, like able to be accessed. And I think she is having a lot of fun just diving into genres that some of the older and more jaded of us might like think are not as exciting or something. But she's really seems like someone that is like, oh, there's all this music for me to discover, and to sample, to interpolate in interesting ways. So I get that sense of the excitement of discovery for her, and that there's going to be all these random corners of music history that she's going to be pulling from. So I'm very excited for her new metal record.
I did think it was notable that Boys a Liar Part 2 is tacked on to the end of this album as track 13. It got hotline blinged, basically.
I was going to say, if Drake can do it, then PinkPantheress can do it too.
Which is just, okay, I know this is my huge song and it hasn't officially landed on the album yet, so I might as well put it on here for the stats. And yet it doesn't feel like of a piece with this album. And in fact, Capable of Love, which is to me the real closer of the album, the 12th track, which might be her longest song yet, really feels like an album closer. And then you get Boys a Liar as a little bit of a bonus track. It's obvious on its face what's going on here. But then you think of, you get Heaven Knows as a complete project, and it really does feel like a bigger swing. The names and the credits on this are quite nuts. You get a lot of writing and production from Greg Kurstin, which I was not expecting to see. You know, you have Cash Cobain and Benny X on here, London on the Track, you know, some of the big rap producers of the moment. Mike Dean snuck in the credits here a couple times. And then you have, Muramasa, who you mentioned, perhaps her closest collaborator. You have a Rema feature on the opening track. You have Rema doing a little Playboi Carti impression, I would say, on the first track, Another Life. And it does feel ambitious, even if the sort of laid backness is intact. It feels fuller and more ambitious than her previous releases. Central C is on here as well. Again, there's some real swings. Was there a track on here, Kemi, that caught you either as a single ahead of time or when you were able to hear the whole album that you thought, oh, like she's really going for it? Boys a Liar was not a fluke, but she is ready to play in this big league.
I think it was just the album as a whole, to me, felt like someone who was really trying to push themselves. I think when I was listening to it, obviously PinkPantheress has a very distinct sound, but I feel like I can hear her trying to experiment to push herself to do something different with this album. I think when picking collaborators, she has picked collaborators that you would really expect, like Willow, for example. You would really put her and Willow together. However, I wouldn't have necessarily put her with Rema, because Rema's sound is nothing like the PinkPantheress sound that we have come to expect. However, PinkPantheress is a young girl and she's a young Black woman. She's of Kenyan descent, so I'm guessing Afrobeats is something that she's heard around the house or that she plays around her own house. But actually, she was saying that she had a lot of Rema songs on her phone, so she just thought, yeah, that would be a really interesting collaborator. And I think her trying to tap into different sounds and tap into different moods, this album does actually have a bit more light in it, even though it's got themes of love and the afterlife and death, etc. like in the album. I do think that some of the songs, it's quite clear that she's just talking about falling in love, and it's not quite as painful as some of her other descriptions of love. So yeah, I think the album as a whole for me just felt like someone almost graduating. Like there was not that uncertainty before. It's more like experimentation that seems to be the thing that's driving her at the moment.
Yeah, and something that I really appreciate about it is that you mentioned, Joe, there's a lot of different producers who are associated with their own types of sounds and a lot of collaborators that like she hasn't worked with before, but it never feels like someone's just like giving her one of their beats and then her like doing her thing over it. It sounds more like she is enveloping all these different collaborators into her bubble and making them make sense within the PinkPantheress universe, which I think is the opposite of the early days when she's taking these recognizable samples or these somewhat more obscure samples and doing almost like a collage like thing. Like it never feels to me on this record like, okay, here's the London on the Track song, or like it, you get that sense, but it doesn't, it still feels like it's her within her universe. And I think that's what makes it work as a sort of cohesive album rather than the kind of mixtape feel. There is just something where she and her particular aesthetic are at the center of the whole album.
I was also impressed by that. There's a moment on here, the song Bury Me, which features Kalela, and it's like PinkPantheress goes hyperpop, ? And I was like, surely this is one of the songs produced by Danny Harrell from PC Music, who's also in these credits here before he pops up on the new Dua Lipa song, apparently, based on Instagram. And then I go to the credits and that's a Benny X song. Benny X, who worked his way up from producing for Yeat to producing for Drake and Yeat. And you're right, it's not obvious. So let's listen to a little bit of Bury Me.
Now you're not my friend, you're just a little bit beneath. There's no need for this pretend, no. I still call it pretend, cause I can see how you wired, and I don't mean to offend. Cause I love watching you smile, the way that you feel. You took a step back, and now I'm missing my meals. So why can't we just be who we are, baby? Why can't we just be who we are, baby?
The record that I kept thinking about when I was hearing this album for the first time was actually the Grimes album Art Angels, which is her follow-up
haven't
to
heard
Visions.
that name in years.
Right? I was like, am I going to date myself? But I think that there's an interesting comparison there of this sort of, in some sense, outside the walls of the gatekeeping of who's allowed to be a producer. And at the time, you're getting a younger female artist who there's certain people critiquing their production choices and whatever, and kind of making that next leap into something like a little bit glossier and larger, but also like in a way that feels like it's referencing hyperpop, but not actually hyperpop at the same time. I mean, that did not exist yet when Art Angels came out like 10 years ago, but that was a record I kept hearing in this, and it's not like a direct thing. And again, that just got me thinking of like how far we've come in the past 10 years of that narrative of who's allowed to be a producer, where the interesting ideas are coming from, and like how much gatekeeping there is around producing. Because that seems like something that PinkPantheress wants to disrupt a little bit. And we had an interesting exchange in our interview where she was saying like, I'm not a gearhead. I find when people have really expensive equipment and they're like into how expensive it is, those are the people I don't want to work with, because we're like...
That was cool. Yeah, that was legitimately cool.
Yeah. And she, like, there is this edge to her still, both, I think, on the record, and like I found that in conversation too. Like, she knows what she wants and she knows what she doesn't want too, and is not afraid to say that both in the studio and publicly. She had this line too where she said, I think being a producer just really comes down to having a good ear at the end of the day. And you can buy as much equipment as you want and train yourself on whatever software, but if you don't have that ear, then there's not going to be that truth to what you're doing. And I think she has a great ear. And I think that's the through line of these different iterations of her music, that there is a sensibility, whether she's knowing what song to sample and when, or just knowing what a good melody is that's going to sound good atop like a beat that she's working on herself or with another producer. I think the through line is that ear.
I think that's a great call about the sort of democratization, the late move towards parity or equality in production. And I think you're right. Like, you can trace a through line from Bjork to Grimes to Rosalia to PinkPantheress, you know, and that really is a lineage of sort of teaching yourself to be a producer at home in your bedroom outside of the world of fancy gear and gatekeeping. And coming back to the idea of ear, I think, yes, all of those people have that in common. What do you think the role of the sample is in this phase of PinkPantheress' career? Because I think, especially when you compare it to the big dumb samples that are dominating the radio and popular music and streaming services at the moment, she has a bit more of a curatorial sense, I think. And maybe that's just because we're not British. But the obscurity of some of the samples, I think this album is not, there's not as much stuff that is immediately obvious, if at all. Did she speak with either of you guys about how she wanted to treat sampling moving forward?
Yeah, she, in our conversation, not that she was devaluing the samples of her past work, but it really felt like she was trying to challenge herself to not rely so much on samples. I think when we were talking about the sound of this album, she was, I can't do the same thing over and over again. I won't be learning anything. So even like calling in instrumentation and trying to get someone in to play the guitar and try and explain to that person the sort of vibe that she's going for on the track, I think she was finding that element of making music really exciting, because that is just a realm that she hasn't really lived in. Also, just she hadn't had the budget to bring things together in that way. So I think rather than her turning her back on samples forever, I think it was just like a real opportunity for her to think about how she could create the Pink Panther sound from scratch rather than try and figure out what speaks to her that already exists.
Something I appreciated too was that, you know, I asked her about this trend, which John Caramonica has written about last year really well, of just like the very obvious sample, the super freaky girl having super freaky, you know, that it's like
right. First class,
just something that is going, first class and everything like that, that it almost feels like it's engineered to go up the charts and hit that nostalgia button for people. I think that she still wants to do something more obscure and more just less obvious than that. I brought that trend up and she was like, I literally hate that. She not like throwing shade at any particular artist, but was like, that's not me. And she said, I've had producers like bring samples to me or bring beats that were doing that, and I've said no. She was like, when someone brings me a sample and it's something I literally haven't heard before, then I'm interested. And if it sounds like something that's like within the sorts of sounds that are interesting to her. So I thought that was interesting and counter to just like another way that she's not trying to do the really obvious thing to get the big chart number one. I think she's trying to build a body of work and to figure out how to articulate her ideas in different formats and in different styles and sounds of music. And that's really cool to see of a new artist trying to figure out what she wants to say in the long haul rather than get like the quick, cheap hit.
Lindsay, do you know if there are samples on Heaven Knows? Because I noticed they weren't included in the official credits. And I didn't know if that was a no sample snitching, purposeful obscuring. Surely they paid for them. But it is funny to think that she moved away from samples when she probably has the budget to do more with them. Are there any samples on this album?
I can't say for sure. It didn't come up. I think it's something that's interesting about even the earlier songs too, is like sometimes the samples are obscured in such a way. I actually didn't realize on Just For Me, the first song she did with Muramasa, that it's actually sampling an American football song, like the emo band.
Seems to be like pitch shifted and then maybe played over. Like it's very obscured.
When you go and listen to the sample, as I did after I was writing the piece, and they were like, no, there is a sample there. I thought it was just a beat that they had made from scratch. And it is. All of this is pushing the definition of from scratch and originality. Like, I think she's someone that has been able to make the art of the sample feel fresh and feel like its own kind of innovation. But there's just sometimes the source material is buried there in a way that's also not very obvious. So I can't say how much of that is on the new album, but I think she now has the budget that if she's bringing a sample to the table, like, she can just get someone to make an original beat that sounds like that. Or I think she's entered this new realm. And I find it fascinating, like seeing how her creative process has evolved and how specific it feels to this moment of the internet and to just instrumental tracks on YouTube or wherever else that you can just play around and have fun with. Like, she's, to me, the best case scenario of that, of someone who has taken those parts of other things and made something that feels very original and very personal to her.
So in this rapid rise of PinkPantheress, the only real bump in the road for her, if you could even call it that, has been when she did eventually get the chance to go outside post-pandemic, not to club on her own, but like to play live. And she went viral a couple times maybe for, let's call them low energy performances. Is that something that is going to hold her back in terms of being a pop star, or do we just not really need that from our bedroom musicians specifically and our TikTok stars? Kemi, did you get any sense of how PinkPantheress was thinking about being a figure in public and a performer?
I guess that's something that I actually find quite endearing about her. Like when I first saw that there were dates going up in London, they were like really small shows. And I was just thinking, yeah, it must be so weird because everyone's going outside all of a sudden and she's very famous. So she's going to have to get good at live performances really quickly. But there was no like gigging in small pubs and nobody knowing who you are. So you could actually become really confident in yourself. It was just straight away on the world stage, having never really been on stage. So I found it really endearing to actually just watch her go through that process and get her confidence. I think there was a performance arranged by Boiler Room, which I thought it was a good performance. If you were in that room, you would have been dancing. Maybe it's not
it didn't
Beychella,
translate.
but at the end of the day, I guess what makes her endearing and what connects her to her fans is this vulnerability. Like they are watching her grow and I think they see a lot of themselves in her. So it'd be really weird if she came out all polished all of a sudden. I think the nice thing about PinkPantheress is watching her go through this journey.
Purse in hand.
I would have advised her to not wear her purse on stage.
That's really, I thought it was cool. I think it's cool. Yeah, Lindsay, what do you think? Does PinkPantheress have to be a rousing live performer to work?
No, I don't think so. I found it very refreshing that she was willing to talk about this really candidly with me. She was like, I don't necessarily like performing on a giant stage. I don't know if I ever will. Like maybe I'll never get there and maybe I'll just have to figure out some other way to perform my music live. She did mention that Boiler Room performance is maybe her favorite because she's just DJing in a room with a bunch of people dancing and her friends. And I think that's more the vibe that she is trying to cultivate on stage. And I asked her, if there were performers that she thought were doing something that she would rather emulate, because she's talked about being a big fan of Paramore and Hayley Williams being an icon for her, but was like, I'm never going to be like that on stage. I'm not.
We can't all be Hayley Williams.
We certainly cannot. And I'm fine with that. The performers that she mentioned were Frank Ocean, who certainly not known for,
Right.
I know, I thought it was like.
We don't have to relitigate that right now, but sure.
No, that's a whole nother podcast. I think we did that one already too. And she mentioned Lana Del Rey too, who I think has been a bit more successful than Frank in translating something that's a little more moody into a compelling live act. But she was telling me the second time we spoke, she really wants to put in the work. She's been taking movement classes. She's taking some singing lessons to work on the breath thing of performing live. Like these are all things that you don't have to think about when you're just in your bedroom, like making music on your laptop. So I think it totally makes sense that she's not there yet. She's supporting Olivia Rodrigo for a leg of the upcoming Olivia Rodrigo tour next year, which feels like the type of thing she didn't want to be doing, but she said she was really excited.
That's the deep end.
Yeah, that is the deep end. But also like opening act for someone else, like sometimes that's not necessarily like the huge spotlight that you think it's going to be. So I think that that's something she's trying to figure out in real time. And that's another part of this process that we're seeing her sort of calibrate since this really quick rise to fame.
I also thought it was really funny that I was speaking to her about the Renaissance tour and she said she didn't see it. And I thought, you definitely could have got free tickets. And she said, I would have just had performance envy because I just know that I'm never going to be able to give that amount of energy. And then I said, so we're not going to see you on a stadium tour anytime soon. And she says she's turned down like quite a lot of like huge gigs because she just couldn't actually face them yet. She just doesn't know whether she's at that point. And I think there's something so nice about just knowing your limits at the stage that you're at. I think if she's only 2-3 years into her career, does she need to be in a stadium?
Yeah, I think she knows what she wants, but she definitely knows what she doesn't want too. And that's refreshing to have someone who's not saying yes to every single opportunity that comes by. She mentioned to me too, she wanted to continue to cultivate this sort of enigmatic personality online. And part of it, she was like, I don't want to be like clogging people's feeds and just like uploading things every day. She's very conscious of the idea of curating the content that she's putting out, basically, which I think makes sense given how her music got popular too. So that's something she's definitely conscious of, just not oversaturating your feed.
That is our show. Thank you so much to Kemi Alemoru, freelance culture writer, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to Lindsay, frequent podcast guest. Go subscribe to The Amplifier.
Yes, please do.
You can find every podcast ever at nytimes.com/podcasts. Listen to us wherever you get your audio content. That's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, where you can also find Podcast Deluxe on video with me and John together. Catch us on the podcast Discord. That's tinyurl.com/podcast Discord, or in the Facebook group, tinyurl.com/podcast Facebook. Ask us questions. John and I and the whole crew might answer them on a future episode of Deluxe or regular podcast. You can email us at popcast@nytimes.com. You can leave questions in the Discord, listener mailbag channel, leave them on the Facebook group. And now you can call and leave us a message on the Popcast hotline. We might even play it on a show. That's 856-539-4305. 856-539-4305. Our show is produced by Pedro Rosado of Headstepper Media, and we will be back next week. Let's go out with a little bit of Nice to Meet You from Heaven Knows by PinkPantheress featuring Central C.
I woke up to my shorty crying. I said, no, I'm not being unfaithful, baby. And somehow she caught me lying. I tried to say it wasn't me, it was one of my G's, we could call the guys. But it wasn't one time, it was 4 or 5. Long story short, we don't talk no more. Now she on TikTok doing story time. I might risk it for a biscuit.